Hello everybody, welcome to the library tonight. My name is Scott Tappa. I work in the College of Letters and Science Dean's office, and I'm responsible for coordinating this community lecture series. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. On your chairs you should see these brochures which list all 8 of our lectures. This is the second one that we've had so far this year. The first one was Pete Zaney, also from the Department of Biology, on turtle migration out on near Jordan Pond. We'll also have another one coming up November 12th, the role of the media in a healthy democracy, from a faculty member in our Department of Political Science. So we hope you can come on out for that. But you're here tonight to listen to Professor Terese Barta from the Department of Biology. Terese has a bachelor's of plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a master's in plant pathology from the University of California, Riverside, and a PhD also in plant pathology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's been teaching at UW-Stevens Point since 1997. Prior to UWSP, Terese taught 4 years at UW-Marathon County and also did teaching for the University of Minnesota College of Biological Sciences during her postdoctoral position at the U of M. Terese's interests are botany, microbiology, plant diseases, mycology, and beer.
Pretty much. Thank you. Well, thank you. It's nice to see a full room, and it's nice to see some familiar faces, including some of my own department members. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak tonight. Feel a little odd. This isn't your typical research talk, at least not in the typical sense. It's not based on ongoing biological research. If you didn't know I was from the Department of Biology, you might think I was... No? Okay. I'll talk up a little more loudly. If you didn't know I was from biology, you might think this is a talk given by somebody from the history department. Perhaps I was a history major in a previous life. I came about becoming a scientist in an untraditional way. I was not a biologist to begin with. I always loved history. And as many of my students know, taking a biology class with Dr. Barta is almost like taking a history class sometimes. So maybe that's where it came from. I do have some research projects going in the lab, though, that do connect with brewing. One of the things I'm doing in the lab these days is I'm collaborating with a beekeeper and mead maker to try to isolate different strains of wild yeasts from honey, a good source of wild yeast, that could potentially be useful in brewing or in other fermentation applications. I do also have a student that's working on a project to try to develop an easy way for brewers to be able to assess the viability of their yeast. So I do have some of my research projects that are connected. How did I get into beer? Originally, I was not a fan of beer. In college, I never touched the stuff. But when I got my first teaching job at the then UW-Marathon County, I wanted to find something that would connect with students on a real level. Most college students know what beer is. And I wanted a real-life application of microbiology. So I called up a fellow postdoc that I had worked with at the University of Minnesota, a guy from Canada who would bring this weird brown stuff in a 2-liter soda bottle after work on Fridays, and we all sit around drinking it. I'm like, well, this isn't beer. So I became interested in what this very young home brewing craze was all about. So I called him up and I said, how do you brew beer? And so he basically kind of told me how to do it by phone. So I started kind of giving little brewing demonstrations in my microbiology class as a way of teaching students some aspects of brewing. And I started doing it myself. In the early days, we could get a canned malt extract and a dry packet of yeast. I can't say the first batches of beer that I made were super great, but with a little bit of practice, I can say now my batches are pretty respectable. I really enjoy it. It's kind of a relaxation for me, a form of cooking. So my introduction into beer was kind of, again, through teaching about microbiology. First of all, what is beer? Beer is basically sugars that are derived from the starch in barley and sometimes wheat. Through an enzymatic process. There are enzymes actually in the grain that are activated through the malting process. And they're fermented by these really wonderful little, my favorite fungus, little yeast cells that are able to take those sugars and make alcohol. Now, sometimes beer is flavored with hops. That's a hop cone in the photo there. But hops were not always used in beer. They weren't really prominent until probably the 15th century. Before that, you could either have just, and it was just called ale at that time, just fermented malt, or in some cases you had different herbs and spices that were used kind of in place of hops. But hops became prominent in brewing because of the fact that it had antibacterial properties. And it allowed beer to last on sea voyages longer than it ever had before. So that's a little bit about beer, but my talk's not going to be telling you about how to make beer. It's really the journey that humans have taken in making this interesting beverage. When you look at a glass of beer, you probably think, oh, it's something great to drink. But to me, beer, the thing that fascinates me about beer is it just has so many different dimensions to it. It is biology. It's understanding the role of living organisms, which we didn't appreciate until Louis Pasteur demonstrated that yeast were necessary for fermentation in the late 1800s. It's also chemistry. There's a lot of water chemistry that's involved, and biochemistry. It's art because it involves creativity, just like cooking is a form of art, coming up with different recipes. It's history because it's been part of the human story for so long. It's culture, many different cultures. So many different languages have a word for beer. And it's also economics. Speaking of economics, here in Wisconsin, it has a pretty big role to play in the economics of our state. We are number 14 in terms of the number of breweries. We have, I think it's over 200 now out of the 7,500 breweries that are in this country. And economic impact, around $2 billion. Now that's not just the beer production itself, but everything associated, the farming and the serving beer, restaurants, beer distribution. We can't ignore the importance of beer to the state from an economic standpoint. But let's go way back to the beginning. Where it all started was about 10,000 years ago when humans were shifting from a hunter-gatherer type of existence to an agrarian life where they would settle down. The nice grassy hills of Kurdistan here about 10,000 years ago is where barley's wild relatives were found. And humans started domesticating grain. Archaeological evidence shows that barley was one of our first foodstuffs, became very important in the diet, and actually played a role in humans deciding to settle down rather than having to move around a lot. They could settle down, grow their food in place, created other problems. They had to figure out how to store it and keep track of it. But it allowed humans to develop an existence that was different than they'd had before. Barley is also very adaptable to a lot of different climates. It can be grown in relatively cool and arid climates, so it could spread. Beer has always been thought of more as food, at least in the early stages, more than a beverage. We don't know exactly how beer came about, although we have archaeologists have given us some interesting ideas. Humans learned that if you took grain and you ground it up and you soaked it, for a while it would soften and you could put it into soups and you could make porridges out of it and gruel. If you allowed the grain to sprout before grinding it up, it became sweeter. And so we think probably what happened is more thick gruel could be baked into bread. Thinner gruel, somebody probably discovered if you just kind of let it sit out for a while, it would become somewhat effervescent and would develop some pleasurable aspects such as alcohol. So we think baking and brewing kind of went hand in hand. We know that it was important in ancient Sumeria. The Sumerians gave us one of the first great civilizations in the Middle East. The ancient Sumerians gave us some of the earliest forms of writing, earliest forms of taxation, number of different contributions ancient Sumerians made. You can see here an ancient Sumerian tablet kind of describing beer rations. Some of the first accounting systems came from ways that the ancient Sumerians had to keep track of where people were storing their grain and how much of it they had stored. We know it was important to the Sumerians because Apparently they used 40% of their barley harvest just for beer. That's a pretty good chunk of their crop investment into beer. They also had a goddess by the name of Ninkasi, and there's a famous poem called the Hymn to Ninkasi that is basically a recipe for making beer. And it's one of the first pieces of evidence that there's a link between brewing and women. And it's no accident that Ninkasi is a female goddess. So the importance of brewing as being one of the domestic arts, there's evidence for that in the link to a female deity rather than a male deity. Babylonians, about 2,000 years ago, also by that time had about 20 different types of beer. They used a kind of a red barley variety to make their beer. And we know that a really important set of early laws called the Hammurabi specifically prescribed certain aspects of beer selling and tavern keeping. At that time, you could pay for beer with barley, but you were forbidden to pay for it with silver. And any tavern keeper, many of which were women, any tavern keeper that would sell beer for silver could be put to death, or would be very likely put to death. So they took their beer pretty seriously. Egyptians had great respect for brewers as well. This is a carving on a tomb. They had quite a number of different beer recipes then. Some of them had things like honey and dates incorporated into the brewing. There were about 100 different kinds of medicine that incorporated some type of beer. A common greeting if you were meeting someone on the street in ancient Egypt would be to use the phrase beer and bread, wishing somebody good health in the form of adequate sustenance. Interestingly enough, women were not allowed to have beer, but if a woman somehow snuck or was given a sip of beer out of a man's cup, they were instantly betrothed and the guy had to marry her. Also, the custom of raising your glasses and clinking your glasses together also comes from a cultural tradition where people would often, and because beer was still had a lot of grain residue, beer was often sipped through long straws in a common vessel. And sipping beer together was considered a sign of great trust and respect for somebody. And so when you raise your glass and you touch it, you are, in essence, acknowledging that you are drinking from a common vessel. So it's an important cultural tradition that goes way back to the ancient Egyptians. Fast forwarding a little bit in time and heading over to Europe, because Europe is an important part of our tradition. We have it pretty well established that brewing was going on in Germany sometime in the 500 to 1000 years Common Era. Germany gave us our first brewing guild controlled who could make beer. They developed a style of beer called lager, which uses a very interesting type of yeast, which we now know is a hybrid between two different species. One is New World and one is Old World, and geneticists are still trying to figure out how those yeasts got together. But lager involves brewing or fermenting beer at a low temperature with this other species of yeast. And Germans also gave us the first brewing manual back in the 1500s. Also, an interesting thing that developed from beer is people recognized that drinking beer was safer than water. And back in the Middle Ages, of course, people didn't realize that you couldn't, use your stream water for waste and then drink it and be healthy. But they didn't put those two things together, but they knew that because beer had to be boiled, it was safer to drink than water. Interesting thing about the Catholic Church is they have a saint for just about everything. And there's a saint, perhaps not real familiar to many of you, called Saint Arnold, Arnulf. And he was from a German town called Metz. And he's considered to be the patron saint of brewing and hop growing. There's several miracles attributed to Saint Arnold, two of them involving beer. The first one had to do with the fact that there was apparently a plague going on. I don't know what kind of plague, not likely to be the bubonic plague, but some type of plague was going on. People were dying by the thousands. And he suggested to people that they drink beer rather than water. And miracle upon miracles, the plague came to an end. So that's the first miracle attributed to St. Arnulf, and he spent his life promoting drinking of beer over water. The other miracle that's attributed to him is after he died, his remains were being brought back to the town of Metz. And the pilgrims that were bringing his remains back, you know, they got tired along their journey, and they decided to stop and have a little refreshment. And one of them prayed to St. Arnold, and then they started passing around this mug of beer, and apparently it never went empty. So it was kind of like the loaves and fishes sort of thing. So that would be a nice kind of party to go to, passing around a mug that never goes empty. All right. As the Germans invaded other countries, brewing moved north. There was an interesting connection, again, between the Catholic Church and brewing that occurred in the Middle Ages. Kind of the monastic brewing that you had in France and Belgium. During the 8th and 9th century, there became known amongst the religious orders what they called the Rule of St. Benedict. The Rule of St. Benedict has two main parts to it. Number one, monks were supposed to be self-sufficient. They were supposed to basically provide for their own needs and not be dependent on the outside world. And of course, they could sell what they made and get money for that, but really important, you know, they brewed beer so that during days in which they had to fast from solid food, they were allowed to have beer, and that would keep the calories up and keep them hydrated. But the other part of St. Benedict's is that the monks were always supposed to be a welcoming presence to any travelers. And so by making a lot of beer, they could always give that refreshment to any travelers that would be coming through an area. This was promoted by Charlemagne, but fast forward to the French Revolution. As you may know, during the French Revolution, the abbeys were either destroyed or taken over by the French, and a lot of the different orders were kicked out. A lot of them went to Belgium, and so certain orders there were offshoots of the Benedictine orders, and one of the orders settled at a place called La Trappe. And hence you have the development of what they call Trappist beers, beers made in certain abbeys in Belgium. And so Belgium is one of my favorite countries because not only do you have some of the world's best beer, you also have chocolate, and you also have lace and a few other really nice things that get made there. Now we're going to kind of go overseas and look at kind of the origins of brewing in the United States. We knew before European settlers arrived that the Native Americans did have certain beer-like beverages that they made out of corn and birch syrup. I've had birch syrup. I'm not sure. It really would have been a great tasting beverage, but they did have some things that they fermented. One of the first colonies that we established in this country, though, was the Jamestown colony, and they made a big mistake when they came over. They forgot to bring a brewer with them. And of course, they knew from coming over from Europe that drinking water could be the kiss of death. And so they were really heavily dependent on beer. Unfortunately, like I said, they forgot to bring somebody that knew how to brew with them, so they kept having to get beer supplied to them, shipped back over from England. Eventually, 2 years after the Jamestown settlement, they eventually put an advertisement back in England advertising for a brewer. So after that, pretty much any new colony, one of the first things they had to build was a brewery. You all probably know the history of the Mayflower and how they left a little later than they planned, and they were coming over, and they were supposed to arrive here, I think, in September, and it ended up being more like December. Why did they have to stop at Plymouth Rock? Well, they got blown off course. The winds were different than they had anticipated. It blew them a lot north. They could have continued down the coast closer to Jamestown, but there was one little tiny problem. Their beer supplies were running low. As the journal of the ship captain notes that the food and beer was considered a food then, the beer supplies were running low. And the sailors were a little bit concerned. They needed to have enough beer to get them back to England. And they were a little bit worried. They wanted to kick the pilgrims off the ship and not let them have any beer. But they did allow them to stay on the ship, and they shared their beer supplies. But the reason they landed in Plymouth Rock is because they were running out of beer. All right. First commercial brewery was in 1632 in what's now Manhattan. It was then called New Amsterdam by the Dutch West India Company. So brewing was well established in this country by 1630s. Going into once we get to the 1700s, the American Revolution, beer played a pretty vital role. Taverns became a very important meeting place. Taverns weren't just a place you could get beer, you could also get food, you could get lodging, and they became places where you could have political discussions. And of course, we have Sam Adams, who did come from a brewing background. I think his father and grandfather were brewers. A lot of healthy political discussions were held over pints of ale. This is the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, and it's said that Sam Adams and John Hancock plotted the Boston Tea Party raid while at the Green Dragon. In addition to the tavern also being an important place to have meetings and try to discuss what to do about the crisis with England, a lot of the taxation on beer was also at the root of American colonists' dissatisfaction with how things were being run from England. They had what was called the stamp tax, that you could only sell beer and other spirits that had the seal of approval from the crown that added tax. And so taxation on beer was a big contributor to why we wanted to become free from England. After some political unrest in Germany, 1848, there was a big revolution in Germany. They tried to topple a lot of the monarchy. We got a lot of German immigrants into the country. You can see here from the map, the red dots kind of show where there's a high concentration of Germans. The Germans supported labor for a number of different things, but Germans brought with them a new style of beer to this country. Before the Germans arrived, we drank a lot of ales, which are more British in their style. A lot in the Midwest, a lot of the German immigrants came in through Chicago and Milwaukee, but eventually spread north and west in our state. And so that immigration pattern changed the style of beer and the preference that people liked. Lager was a lot lighter, more effervescent, more refreshing. Beer taste changed. The Midwest was a really good place for German immigrants to settle down because they could grow barley, they could grow hops. There was ice on the, in the lake where they could harvest ice for doing the cold lagering process. So Midwest became a really good place for a lot of Germans to settle down. Of course, we also had similar climate, good land for agriculture. And one of the biggest things is Germans brought with them their style of beer, and with their style of beer, their yeast that produced the lager. Just a quick note about the American Civil War. Just like in the American Revolutionary War, beer was an important part of the salary of the militia or the soldiers that were fighting. Also, 1862 was the first federal excise tax, and that had to do with, tax on beer to support the Civil War. The Point Brewery here in town actually did supply beer to the Union Army during the Civil War. Of course, we did an interesting little experiment in the early part of the 1900s called the Volstead Act of 1919. It took effect actually in 1920. The abolishment of anything that had greater than 0.5% alcohol. You could still make beer, but it had to have only 0.5%. That grew out of an interesting combination of factors. You had the temperance movement that started in the 1800s, but newspaper accounts actually demonstrate that part of what added fuel to the fire for Prohibition was an anti-German sentiment that grew out of World War I. And even newspapers that were supportive of the brewing industry, such as the newspapers we had here in Stevens Point, at the time, they were investigated for promoting Bolshevik and German ideas. And so part of what Prohibition grew out of, again was anti-German sentiment. It was repealed in 1933. Into the 40s and 50s, brewers were still worried about a second round of prohibition, and they didn't have to worry about it from a national standpoint, but there was concern that there would be local reenactments of prohibition. Fortunately, it was repealed by 1933, but by then a lot of breweries went out of business. To survive, a brewery either had to make near beer, 0.5% or less, or they could make soft drinks, or milk products, or some of them made what was called malt tonic. They would still do the malting and basically sell the malt product as a tonic. But it was a tough time for breweries. A lot of them went out of business. This graph from the Brewers Association kind of shows that crash in the number of breweries we had in this country started long before Prohibition, though. You see in the 1800s a steady decline, and what really caused a large decline in the number of breweries was the switch from ale to lager. Breweries that didn't make lagers, just, American taste changed, they just went out of business. So, Wisconsin. We are, and at the time of when we had a lot of Germans moving in, we became beer paradise. We had a place to grow barley, we had a place to grow hops. I borrowed this from Kevin Revelinski's book. Basically, beer in Wisconsin, we are a beer state because of the following formula. You take immigrants, thirsty immigrants, you add cold, which provides ice, frozen tundra, you take water. We had lots of fresh water available in the state for brewing on frozen tundra, and what do you have? You have beer. A lot of brewing in the state occurred on a local level with farm breweries. A lot of brewing took place on farms. The importance to agriculture cannot be underestimated. Just like in France and Belgium, farming was a pretty labor-intensive activity, and one way that you could make sure that your farm hands, the people that would come help you plant the crops and harvest the crops, you had to give them something to drink during the day. And so there would be relatively low alcohol beer that would be served to your farm hands. So without beer, we probably wouldn't have been able to get the crops in. Our first brewery, even though we like to think of Milwaukee as kind of being the foundational part of our brewing history, the first brewery was actually not in Milwaukee. It was actually in little old Mineral Point back in 1835. And it wasn't started by Germans. It was started by Welsh miners. And this was actually, in the 1830s, we were a brewing state before we were even a state. We were still part of the Michigan territory at the time. So the original brewery was called the John Phillips Brewery. The first brewery in Milwaukee came about by 1840. It was called Milwaukee Brewery. Again, three Welshmen, Richard Owens, William Pollett, John Davis, set up a brewery. They set it up with some rather, some fly-by-night equipment, not your standard brewing equipment. Eventually, Owens bought his partners out and went to Chicago and bought a real brewing kettle and did well. When they started out, they brewed ales and porters, but eventually switched to lagers by 1880. So that was the first brewery in Milwaukee. The first lager brewery, the first brewery started by Germans in Milwaukee, was in 1841, a year later, called the Lake Brewery, and it changed hands several times. Herman Roethlisberger started it. He sold it to John Meyer, who then sold it to his father-in-law, Francis Newkirk, who then sold it to his other son-in-law, Charles Mems, who became a beer magnate in Milwaukee. The reason I'm kind of going through this person sold it to this person is seemed to be a trend in how you got into the brewing industry. Two common themes I came across when looking at the history of breweries, especially in Milwaukee. You either got it from your father-in-law, in other words, you married the brewer's daughter, or you married the brewer's widow. If somebody died, you got the widow, and you got the brewery out of it. In this case, the brewery was kind of switching between father and sons-in-law. This brewery became the largest brewery, in Milwaukee at the time. And This is the brewery here, and this was Charles Mem's home. He was considered, he got very, very rich off the brewing industry. Now, Milwaukee was a great place for brewing to have its start because you had a lot of Germans, and they knew how to make lager beer. You had ice. In the 1860s, breweries used something like 20,000 tons of ice for keeping the beer cold. A lot of the brewers and breweries also bought into the railroads so that they could control the shipping of ice. That created some interesting conflicts. The Union Brewery in 1850 was the first Milwaukee brewery after Wisconsin gained its statehood. It was on what's now Ogden Ave in Milwaukee. And by 1860, Milwaukee, which had a population of about 45,000 people, had about 35 breweries. So you're probably familiar with some of the big names in brewing. There are like 4 major brewery powerhouses that came out of the brewing industry in Milwaukee. First one was Pabst. Didn't start out as Pabst. It was actually a brewery started out by the Empire Brewery, Jacob Best and Sons. Frederick Pabst took it over. He was the son-in-law. So there's rule number 1, you marry the boss's daughter. This Pabst eventually became the largest producer of beer and the largest US producer. So this was big stuff. Interesting, when they started bottling beer, women did a lot of work on the brewing line. It was hard work, very poorly paid work, but women did a lot of work on the bottling line. Schlitz. How many of you haven't heard of Schlitz? That was a brewery actually founded by August Krug. He died in 1856. He had hired Joseph Schlitz as his bookkeeper. Well, guess what Schlitz did? He married August Krug's widow and took over the brewery. Unfortunately, he died he drowned at sea going back to Germany for a trip. And so it passed to his nephews, I believe they were his nephews, the Uline brothers. One of the significant things about the Uline brothers is one of the Uline brothers, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, they brought back from Germany their special purified yeast. They had just figured out over in Germany the importance of actually using a pure culture of yeast. And so he brought back this special lager yeast that had been purified to get it away from other types of yeast and bacteria. Of course, Schlitz has the famous moniker, the beer that made Milwaukee famous. Unfortunately, Schlitz came to a rather untimely end. They tried to speed up the lager process and try to do the brewing faster. It resulted in an inferior product. People took notice. They stopped buying the beer. They started losing money. They then tried to make up for the loss in revenue by reducing the wages of the workers. That didn't sit so well. The workers struck, and eventually Schlitz went out of business, and they were bought up by Stroh's. Blatz. This guy actually did come from a brewing background, although he did marry a brewer's daughter, but he did learn about brewing in Germany. Valentine Blatz. What Blatz is famous for is they were the first beer that was actually bottled. And then Miller. Miller's a pretty famous name in the state. We've got a baseball stadium that's named for Miller. Frederick Miller was actually educated. He was an educated guy, was educated in France. He and his wife came over and for about $8,000 bought an abandoned brewery off of the Jacob Best family. It was what they call the Plank Road Brewery. Sadly, his wife and all his kids died at some point, and that really took a toll on him. So, in those days, there were a lot of childhood illnesses and influenza, and pretty much his whole family was wiped out. He did marry, however, again, and had another family. And Elise Miller was a daughter from his second marriage. She actually became the first woman to ever run a big brewery. In 1937, she actually became the head of the Miller Brewery. Of course, at a later point in time, Miller actually merged with Coors, and we kind of know how that story went. So I want to also make mention of the fact that you can not only grow barley, but you could also grow hops in Wisconsin. At one point, Wisconsin was a huge hop state. In fact, almost all the production of hops for the United States brewing came from here in Wisconsin, about 75%. And a fairly good chunk of even the nation, the worldwide hop production. Unfortunately, between like 1860 and 1920, there was a series of plant diseases, and this is where kind of my background as a plant disease specialist kind of comes into play and catches my eyes. There were a couple of mildew diseases, downy mildew and powdery mildew, that started devastating the hops crop, and the combination of the fungal diseases and the insect problems pretty much wiped out production, and production of hops then moved to the West Coast where it was drier and not favorable for those types of diseases. But hops are making a comeback here in the state, especially now that we have some varieties that have better disease resistance, but there's even some kind of heirloom varieties that are being grown on a small scale. All right. Hops, by the way, they look like cones, and we do call them hop cones, but it's actually a female, we call it an inflorescence, a cluster of flowers. Hops actually have separate male and female plants, and so we just grow the female because we get the cluster of flowers from the female. All right, how many people know where this place is? All right, I have to bring it local. We have something to be proud of here. Stevens Point, the Stevens Point Brewery is actually the 5th oldest continually running brewery in the United States, and the 3rd oldest privately owned brewery here in the United States. So we've got a little bit of a beer history to be proud of here in Stevens Point. If you look on the Stevens Point website, they claim that the brewery started in 1857. It may have it's likely it actually started before 1857. Records are a little bit unclear. We know that the brewery was undergoing a big renovation project in 1857, but we think it may have been around for a little longer. It was originally started by Frank Wall and George Reuter, and George Reuter eventually left and went and started a brewery up in Wausau, which became a pretty large brewery. Frank Wall eventually sold to Andrew and Jacob Lutz in 1867. This is actually a picture I found of what the brewery looked like back then. There were some competitors for the Stevens Point Brewery, but none of them lasted very long. Most of them faded out within about 10 years. Again, 1857, the city of Stevens Point was about 4,500 people, relatively small town. But largely made up of German immigrants. Of course, we like to think of Stevens Point as being a Polish community. The Polish also had their brewing traditions, but the Polish were a little bit more restrained in their enjoyment of beer, partly because of Roman Catholicism. But, we really owe a lot of our, brewing traditions to the Germans in combination with the Poles. The Stevens Point Brewery went through a lot of changes in its history. In the late 1890s, it was sold again, became the Gustav Kinzel Brewing Company, became the Stevens Point Brewing Company in 1902. Managed to survive Prohibition by making near beer, the 0.5% beer, as well as malt tonic. So they managed to survive the Prohibition years, also in part because they had a good relationship with the community of Stevens Point that really backed them. It was bought out by Ludwig Korfmann. Then it became known as the Stevens Point Beverage Company. For a large part of their history, they were owned by the Shabilskys, kind of an important name in Stevens Point history here. Interesting thing happened that kind of gained notoriety for our little brewery in 1973. Chicago Tribune columnist by the name of Mike Royko decided he would host this big beer taste competition. And lo and behold, the Stevens Point Special Lager won top prize for the American beer category. They were number 2 overall. A German beer won overall, but winning this competition really put Stevens Point on the map. Sadly, we were actually owned by a Chicago company for a while, but back in 2002, fell back into Wisconsin ownership, and in 2007, Stevens Point Brewery actually hosted its 150th anniversary. So Point Special was actually brewed originally in 1857. It's been one of the types of beers that has been in continual production here. And you can see kind of, this is an actual beer label from a 1930s beer, and you can see it, you know, they've kept some of the stylistic features of the beer label kind of in honor of that. So I want to really thank you for your attention, for coming out tonight. I hope even if you're not a tremendous beer fan, that maybe you have a newer appreciation at some particular level. So thank you very much for your attention. Those of you interested in some interesting books, I put my references here. I'd like to point out one interesting thing, especially to my UWSP colleagues, is one source of information I found on the history of the Stevens Point Brewery was a master's thesis, where is it here, by John Stastny. That's in our library. It was a master's thesis, 1979. And in the acknowledgments, in this particular master's thesis, there's actually thanks to one of our former deans. Anybody want to guess who that is? Justice Paul. May ring a bell to some of you, who was also a former dean of our College in Letters and Science. But at that time, Justice Paul was a member of the history department. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So a master's thesis actually produced here at the university. I'd also like you to keep your eye out within the next year or so. There's going to be a book published by a fellow by the name of John Harry. He lives down in Milwaukee. He's got a book coming out on the history, a more detailed history of the Stevens Point Brewery. So kind of watch for that. So at this point, again, thank you. And if you've got any questions, I would be happy to entertain them. Yes.
Could you say a little bit more about the resurgence of hop growing in Wisconsin in terms of like the varieties and so forth?
I'm not sure exactly what varieties are all being grown. I know it's an area of an expanding market opportunity. Hops like it kind of warm and sunny. So I can't say I know all the different hops that are being grown in the state right now. I do know that there are some rediscovered varieties that were kind of out in the wild for a while. They must have escaped and were growing wild, and they're kind of being brought back as a heritage variety. Pearl Street Brewery in La Crosse has a variety that some farmer discovered the hops growing on his land, and they use that type of hops in a particular type of pale ale that they make now. Yeah, Northern Discovery is the name of it. Mm-hmm. Got some beer aficionados here. Yes?
Have you heard there's a brewery in Door County? It's attempting to brew beer in the old Belgian way of
Open fermentation? Not aware of that, but that's not a new idea. Even Oso Brewery has done that. That's also something New Glarus Brewery has done. They've converted their older brewery into an open air facility where they allow the microbes to colonize the wood timbers and open up the windows in the summer so all those fun yeasts from nearby orchards and that can blow in. So other breweries have done that, but to try to replicate, because there's a style of beer that supposedly can only be done properly within about a 40-kilometer radius of Brussels because of the combination of wild yeasts that are in the air. A lot of people have been trying to recreate that lambic style here. And it's really interesting because it's caused by a microbial succession. Different bacteria and yeast participate in the making of the lambic. And you can't just throw all those organisms in and get that beer. They have to kind of go through this process of one organism is predominant and then it's replaced by another one and another one.
Terese, do you want to give a quick plug for your course on microbiology for
Yeah, several years ago, I mean, having a little knowledge of brewing plus skills in microbiology and the opportunity to teach at the university has created an opportunity for me to be able to reach out to professional brewers. And for the last 6 years, I've been offering a microbiology workshop that teaches brewers how to manage their yeast and how to test for spoilage microorganisms in their beer. I teach that several times a year. But again, it's kind of one of the ways I like to demonstrate to the outside community that the university, we're here to help the people of the state. You know, the motto of the University of Wisconsin is that the boundary of the university is the boundary of the state. And so I feel really lucky being able to do something that actually helps part of our, private sector in helping to keep the quality of beer up, because there was a kind of a craft beer boom that occurred like in the 80s, and it crashed because the quality was so poor. And it's now on an upsurge again, and brewers are appreciating the importance of knowing what microbes are in their beer. So it's nice to have those relationships. Yeah, Dale.
Can you say something about the history of maltsters in Wisconsin in particular?
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, we can not only boast, about our brewing legacy, but we actually have in Chilton, Wisconsin, one of the country's biggest and most famous malt houses. It's Terese Malting, and they provide malted barley and malted grains for breweries all over the country. So little old Chilton, we're pretty big into malting. In the early days of brewing in Milwaukee, breweries basically were 1 to 2 floor operations that did everything from start to finish. They made their own malt, they did their own mashing, they did their own brewing. It all was in-house. But now breweries purchase their malted barley, and they get it from companies like the Terese Malting Company. So thanks for bringing that up. And they also have in Chilton, there's a big brew fest every spring in May, and you have to get tickets months in advance to stand a chance to go there. So, yes?
I'm curious about how cider occupies kind of its own space versus beer. And I don't know if you could speak to that at all.
Well, a little bit. You've heard the story about Johnny Appleseed going across the country planting apples, and everybody thinks, oh, he's really nice, he's planting apples, so we have something to eat. No, one of the first things as Americans started moving west is they had to have something to make alcohol out of, especially if they couldn't grow barley. So apples were basically a source of another fermented beverage. And so that's kind of, cider also plays an important role in our migration and expansion westward. So we mainly grew apples, and they were not the apples we have today. There was little sour, small things, but apples were important. Cider was important because you could either drink the alcoholic cider or you could distill it and then make things like brandy and stuff out of it. And in northern France, they actually distill their fermented apple juice, and they age it in oak, and it's called Calvados. It's kind of what Normandy is famous for. And you'll notice that I didn't really talk about wine cultures. The Greeks and Romans really loved their wine, but the Greeks did do some brewing just in outlying areas where they didn't have access to wine. But there were parts of Europe where it was just too cold to grow grapes. So brewing took a stronger hold there. You need the Mediterranean, nice warm place to grow grapes.
You mentioned that some sailors and farmhands required alcohol for their duties.
It wasn't they required alcohol, they required something safe to drink to stay hydrated.
Okay. Well, why wouldn't they just, if it wasn't the alcohol.
It really wasn't the alcohol, and a lot of the beer during colonial times was relatively low alcohol, and even kids drank it. It's just because people were afraid of drinking water. So you drank beer to stay hydrated, and it also gave you calories. But it wasn't really drunk for the alcohol as much as something to keep you hydrated.
So these older strains, they produce much lower alcohol content?
Well, they just didn't use as strong of they didn't use as much grain per batch, so the sugar content was lower, and if you lower the sugar content, you lower the alcohol content. So it just wasn't as highly alcohol beer. I mean, now, you know, the big craze are these barrel-aged, super duper, you know, 12% alcohol beer aged in bourbon barrels, knocking your socks off. But in colonial periods, no, beer was much less. And what they called beer back then in the colonial era was something that had hops in it. What they called ale was actually beer without hops. And then eventually over time, beer became the more generic term, and under the beer category, you had the ales and the lagers. The ales were fermented with a different kind of yeast at warmer temperatures. Lagers were fermented at lower temperatures with a different kind of yeast and required aging. That's what lagering is a process where you age the beer in cold, very cold conditions to let it mellow. And so the idea, I remember there was a beer slogan, fresh beer tastes better. Well, lagers are supposed to be aged at least 3 months. So I wouldn't call a lager a fresh beer, but that was kind of one of the marketing things. So lagers are designed to be stored under very cold temperatures. And so a lot of lagers were brewed in the wintertime. All right.
Any other questions for Dr. Barta?
All right. Well, again, thank you.